Time, we see no such discontinuity.
Define death, then.
Okay, Romans 5:12 is speaking about human death. That's when human death came into effect for the first time. Notice the text says, death through sin. Only human beings amongst all species of life can experience death through sin. And then Paul closes it off by saying death through sin was visited upon all human beings. He's careful to exclude the plants and the animals, as he does in 1 Corinthians 15:20-22. Again, he limits it to humanity. And so, yes, there was no human death until the fall of Adam and Eve, but that does not exclude plant and animal death. And hey, if Adam and Eve are eating, obviously plants are dying.
Okay. Kent, start me off in terms of when did entropy start? What happened when Adam and Eve sinned? What kind of death are we talking about?
The earth was created, and heavens and earth, everything was created in 6 literal 24-hour days. Apparently, entropy came in when Adam and Eve disobeyed God. It came in as a result of the fall. Before that, had they not sinned, they would have lived forever. And of all the things that Hugh Ross teaches that I would object to, this one is probably the most serious. This one, I would say, borders on heresy, because it leads right into why did Christ die on the cross? If there's already death in the world, see, his philosophy is God created a world where the lions eat the zebras, suffering and agony and is normal. And then when you read Genesis 1:31 at the end of the chapter, God looked at everything and said it was very good. If that's his idea of very good, then we have a very different God, which leads to the question, why did Christ die on the cross?
Hidden from the astronomer's view through the telescope.
Yeah.
As far as when entropy came into the world, I don't know. I suspect it was at the fall of Adam. The Bible says God looked at everything at the end of chapter 1 and said it was very good. The Bible tells us very clearly in Exodus 20:11, God said, I want you to rest on the 7th because I made everything in 6 days. Everything in heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is. And if the average layman cannot understand that verse, then the Bible is incapable of being understood. In 1960 and 1970 and 1980, we check the dust today and assume, well, that's the way it's always been. This is uniformitarianism. This was Charles Lyell's problem, and several times in the last previous debates, Hugh has referred to, the fossil record or the geologic column. Well, I taught earth science for years. You can only find that dumb geologic column one place in the world. That's in the textbooks. It doesn't exist. Charles Lyell made up the whole thing. All those layers, well, some other people helped, but all those layers of rock that we see were formed during the flood in the days of Noah. I've got pictures on my website of petrified trees standing up, running through a whole bunch of different layers.
You're misrepresenting the field. What geophysicists and geologists believe is that it's a combination of catastrophism and uniformitarianism.
Here you are speaking for all geologists again. You do this consistently, and I wish you'd stop and think about what you're doing.
Well, find a secular geologist that doesn't endorse catastrophism. They all endorse it.
I can find lots of geologists that don't endorse the idea that do believe all those layers were deposited in a flood.
I would agree, but many floods, not just one.
No, just one big flood formed nearly all the layers. And so fully formed, fully functional.
They were fully functional. It's the chicken or the egg. God makes the chicken first.
He makes the chicken, I agree. Now, why can't he do that with the stars? What is your problem there?
Well, because the text doesn't use the word bara with respect to the stars. It does for Adam and Eve, but it doesn't use that word for the stars.
Well, I showed you where it does. In chapter 1, it says, God, let us make man in our image. The next verse says, God created man. It uses them interchangeably, and there's hundreds of examples
I'm
of
not
that.
agreeing that it's interchangeable. I believe it's referring to two different characteristics of humanity. Peaceable environment where we accept one another's Christian testimony.
One comment I would make, in Hosea chapter 6, when it talks about the day of the Lord, that may be a literal 24-hour day. There is going to be a day when he comes and redeems this world. So to take the 300 references where it's clearly a 24-hour day and say we have one where it's questionable, that one still could be a 24-hour day. And then to build a whole doctrine based on that one questionable verse, I think that's real thin ice to be skating on.
But if you only got one passage in the Bible where numbered days refer to natural creation, that establishes an entirely different context.
Well, again,
that does give you the basis for an exception.
I would go back to what I've said many times. What your interpretation of Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 and Exodus 20:11 and the Ten Commandments, that interpretation requires a guru to come up with that.
How about
the average person doesn't read it and say
How
that.
about Genesis 2?
Paper right here.
I got lots of papers too, but let me just show you. The Bible says very clearly in Exodus chapter 8, we behold the work of God, and you cannot find out what God has done by beholding nature. Hugh's idea that nature is the 67th book of the Bible really put up red flags with me as I read his work. I said, oh, wait a minute now. The Bible says you cannot behold the work, they cannot be reckoned up. It says in Psalm chapter 40, you can behold God's works, but you cannot comprehend them. And he's putting an awful lot of eggs in one leaky basket, saying that because the stars are, his whole argument is the Big Bang must be true because the stars are 17 or 14.9275, whatever it is, billion light years away. This is simply silly. You can't measure those distances. You don't know light's been the same. And if God can make a full-grown man and a full-grown woman and a full-grown tree, he can make stars and light. And 6 times it says he stretched out the heavens. What if he made it here and flung them out, and it was 6,000 years ago?
And rainbows before the flood for God to use that as a covenant signature.
That question.
Okay. This is directed to Dr. Ross. But first, for Dr. Hovind, I have studied Hebrew, and Dr. Ross does an admirable job. He's done his homework. We've talked personally about some of these things, and yet this is directed because we do have some differences. And so, Dr. Ross, in relation to the word yom used in the Old Testament, 359 times it is linked with a number, a numerical index. All but a few times, like Hosea 6:2, it refers to a literal 24-hour solar day.
Sure.
So the evidence seems to support a 24-hour day. How would you deal with this?
Well, how I would deal with it is to make the point that those 300-plus references you found are in the context of human history. Whereas what you've got in Hosea chapter 6 is a prophetic reference using the word day. What you have in Genesis 1 is a reference towards the natural creation. It's a different context. The other references are referring to human history. So you have to examine the context to see which way you should take one of the 3 definitions.
And doing that, there is some very good evidence that it is a 24-hour period. Now, you know, as we've talked, that I'm really open to looking at all the options. I want to know the truth. A lot of people listening want to know what is really the case.